Welcome, Chalice. I'm so excited to have this conversation. It's been a long time coming. I think we connected at ETH Denver, and very quickly, I was so inspired not only by what you've been doing to facilitate Cabin, which is this amazing co-living network of neighborhoods, now with 20 locations. So I can't wait to hear more about that expansion, but also a very cool background in um, birth and death and being, a birth doula, also following this like really beautiful process of also spirituality as a chaplain. So such an amazing story. And if you think about it, like a lot of us are looking to find like what is that next church? What is the church for people, without church? So I feel like there's so many topics to cover here. I've been really looking forward to this. So where are you calling in from right now? And what is your major focus these days?
I'm calling in from the Pacific Northwest, a 100-acre farm that is filled with horses and sheep and chickens and just like a lovely, lush background. It's also very rainy. So, um, and I am mostly focused on in this current present moment, I am facilitating a intro to co-living for folks at the Cabin Network. And then in the meantime, or in tandem, I also am pursuing and finishing my Master's of Divinity, which is to become or to kind of like implement spirituality or spiritual healthcare in whatever I decide to do next or however I decide to do that.
I love that. So beautiful. These like two intersecting and like very honestly related topics, even though they may not seem so. So maybe just for people who are not as aware of the history of Cabin, I think it's so interesting if you could just share how this started, because for many people who might know, it was at first just a DAO, like, basically crowdfunded one location. And now this idea that it's expanded into this network of neighborhoods. Um, can you share more about that story? Like, how did that
Yeah,
happen?
yeah. I've Yes, very much. So like I do a lot of these calls for like interviewing people who want to join Cabin. And so I always do like a highlight, like here's where Cabin's been, here's where Cabin is, and here's where Cabin's going. And so I think a nice way to say that is Cabin started as a creator residency and crowdfunded and crowd or community kind of like organized as a DAO. And then we shifted holding those kind of like same principles of like community funded and community organized and shifted into like retreats and residencies. And then we realized that retreats and residencies weren't getting us the depth of connection that we wanted and that people were looking for. So then we shifted to co-living. And in that same shift, we opened up instead of being one location, we opened up to the network of neighborhoods. And so anybody who is a citizen in the network, a member, can list their property. And so, and all properties are independently owned and operated, but kind of like share the Cabin values and like mission of being close to nature, being around people you love and admire, and having nice high-speed internet. Because most of the people at Cabin work remotely. And so there's just kind of this like deeper exploration or kind of like how can like curiosity around how we can implement technology into community in a holistic manner.
So interesting. So the network of Cabin locations now is people who are members, and is it kind of like Airbnb, like where like share back to like Cabin as like the central coordinator amongst all these groups, or like how does that work for people who decide to be a member and ultimately maybe have their space connected to the Cabin neighborhoods?
Yeah. So ultimately, Cabin is the platform in which these networks or in which the neighborhood exists on, and the citizens can also coordinate on. And so it's kind of like a matchmaking spot where it's like, okay, I'm traveling for this amount of time and I want to go to this like location. And then Cabin is kind of just like the coordinator of those two things.
Super cool. And like, how does like the kind of economics of Cabin work? Like, just to be able to facilitate that and provide that service over time.
Yeah, it's a membership model. And so to be a citizen, you have to have membership. And citizenship is X amount per year. And to become a citizen, you either have to attend a Cabin week. So that's kind of like the intro to co-living, or be vouched for by a member of Cabin.
So cool. And is that public? Like how much membership
Yeah.
is, or what does that look
Yeah,
like?
exactly. Right now it's zero point 0.2 ETH.
Okay. Oh,
Yeah,
amazing.
for the year.
So cool. And so I would love to hear more about your journey into this space of co-living, because when I think about where you've come from and now also where you're going with this idea of this master in divinity around medicine, there is a very strong through line around medicine and like things like non-medical birthing as a doula. How did you go from there and then into cabin?
That's a really good question. So, like you said, I was a doula for about 10 years, and then I shifted. The pandemic happened, and I was kind of outgrowing my doula like existence, you could say, or just kind of like the way that I was existing in the world didn't kind of necessarily align with the doula, and I wanted more. And so I got curious around death and like the other side of the circle of life. And so then I started exploring divinity programs, and Naropa is the one that I'm currently at. And it's a contemplative practice that we kind of then share and show ways of being in the world. And so with my master's divinity and then my doula work and then my just like ingrained sense of community, I'm one of 10 kids. And so I've co-living is like, oh, that was just like growing up for me. And so with those kind of like counterparts, my work at Cabin has been kind of just like second nature and really just attuning to how people connect and create a sense of belonging. And so what Cabin is doing is also like bridging a group of people on the internet to and in physical locations. So really coming back to that like connection to nature and how it's a system, an ecosystem of like more than just humans existing. It's the trees, it's the wildlife. There's so much more than just what us humans necessarily experience.
I love how you're from a family of 10. That makes so much sense. It's so interesting how these like aspects of how we grew up maybe inspire where we ultimately end up. I'm curious, like, what also inspired you to become a doula in the first place? Was there anything
I
that
think
sparked that?
there was just an innate curiosity around life and kind of I was more like becoming a doula. Everybody was always like, why don't you just go be a nurse and like work in labor and delivery? Or why don't you go and become a midwife and just like do it in a more holistic manner? And what really caught my eye or like interest around the doula work is kind of like the emotional aspects or kind of like the intangible. And those like, I believe that like, I think of like death and birth as like portals and thresholds into like a different uh way of being present to the experience. And you can't you can't be at a birth or witness a death and not be present. Like it's really hard to have your attention elsewhere. And so being invited into those spaces as a doula or as a chaplain, it's really just like a sacred space to support and honor and witness humans in transition. And so I think at Cabin, I actually do a lot of that because a lot of people are in transition when they're co-living, whether that be like, oh, I just got a job or I quit a job or I want to live someplace new or I just got out of a relationship. There's something typically that's like turning over. And I think in community and like with others, we can really, and like, again, first and foremost, I think just like a deepen a our own self-awareness to kind of and community and relationship reflects that. So I think what Cabin is doing is kind of just like offering a space, an environment for that to happen.
It's such a fascinating parallel about transitions and
Mhm.
transition. And now you've been acting as a chaplain for around 2 months. Can you share a little bit more about that experience? Is that actually part of the, opposite of the birth experience, and now you're being present in like more death experiences, or what is that actually looking like for you?
Yeah. So within my program as a Master Divinity student, I am exploring I like we could choose as a chaplain, you could like notoriously it's known for end of life care. But a chaplain in this kind of like current context is spiritual care. And so I could have and can exist in a lot of different lines of work. The one that I'm working in right now as a chaplain is at a hospital, and that is mostly end of life care. And so there can be traumas, there can be um, expected deaths, there can be a lot of different things that we experience in our health and wellness, whether that be good or bad. But typically, yes, it is end of life care and supporting others and their loved ones through that time of transition.
It's super powerful. My father actually passed away
Mm,
December this past year, and it was one of the most like spiritually meaningful experiences of my life. And your
mm,
point about witnessing those transition points, and like you can't help but being absolutely present and aware of, like even spaces beyond what maybe this might be in our perception is very, very prominent. And not many of us have had that ability to witness those things. And we're so
mm,
disconnected now from births and deaths, and which used to be so ingrained in our culture and our communities. I'm
mm.
curious then, as somebody who's witnessed so many of these transition moments, for people listening who maybe have never witnessed something like that, a birth or a death, what are some of the most meaningful things you've taken away or learned from those experiences that you would want to share?
I think there's no right or wrong way to do it. And there's oftentimes we get in our heads and think, or we think we have to, like, there's something outside of us that will like make it easier or make it the right way or um, make it better. Something like as a doula, I faced a lot was like, oh, you've never had children. So how would you be able to support people through that? And I think like why I bring this up now is like you don't have to know the way or you don't have to have it like because my experience is not ever going to be like your experience. And so as someone who's supporting that or someone who's witnessing or someone who's experiencing that, it's really just like it all comes down to me is like a presence and like a willingness to like be vulnerable in that moment and like really like find a sense of like union or community or like a sense of like a shared reality, right? Like, but we both can experience this very differently, but it's like this ultimate moment that is not in your control. And so I think like all we can do is like be present to that. And I think also worth noting or tying in here is like where there's grief, there's praise, and where there's praise, there's grief. And so like that duality of like there's an ending and there's a beginning. And so just like really being present without trying to skip through the moments of like the micro moments of like uh that you don't think matter. So I think like something that you can do as a doula, as a chaplain is like offer someone tea or water and like really coming back to these like basic needs that we have as a human and just like how important they are. And just like that gesture of kindness or compassion can really just kind of like have a bigger impact than we actually are maybe intending it to, or it might not. And that just like not being attached to that
Wow.
outcome and just acting with compassion. Hmm.
So powerful because it does relate also to community and co-living. Sometimes, the biggest gesture is just like a smile and like just being kind and being compassionate to like the people around you. Um,
Mm.
I want to sort of dive deeper a little bit on that as well, because I do think there's something where we have been so disconnected to like co-living, living in community. It's become like super individualistic. Death feels very lonely, birth feels very lonely. Do you have any like people, projects, resources that really inspire you that might um, be useful for people who are in a moment of transition, whether they're a loved one is going through a birth or a death, or they're going through one of those experiences? Are there people, resources that really inspire you that you look to for that inspiration?
Speaking firsthand, I find a lot of nurturing and care from people that are within arm's reach. And so I think when you can cultivate community in a very local way of like the people who, whether that be family, chosen family, and kind of just like friends, people who have lived a similar experience or lived a very different experience, I think like that one-on-one connection is really powerful. I think going further out from that, John O'Donoghue is an Irish poet and philosopher, and he has this book of blessings, which is like words can often fill or kind of just like give space for you to explore and feel what you're feeling. Um, I think Krista Tippett is another woman who has a podcast called On Being, and she dives into spirituality and this like new way of connecting with people. And so I think that is, I mean, sometimes soothing. Those are kind of like external things and resources. Um, but ultimately, I think too, being gentle and compassionate to yourself is one of the biggest kind of just like in these moments of death and birth and hardships and expanding to upon a little like the tiny deaths maybe that happen, like the end of a relationship, the end of a job, the end of like a chapter of your life in a certain place or a certain time. Like those can be, but I think the closer we are to those deaths in our lives and like the impact, I think when the bigger deaths of loved ones, of pets, of kind of like our own death can be a little bit less fearful. We can be a little bit less fearful with those.
Wow, how powerful, like how those moments can be like sort of practice. And I talk about this a lot personally, never like on my interviews, but this idea of like the yin and yang or like the masculine, feminine, like how we really celebrate these archetypes of perpetual spring and summer, but we never allow for like the fall and the winters and the death cycles. And I really love what you're sharing, like just like the really simple ways that you can honor the little deaths that happen in life and not try to just breeze through them, forget about them, disassociate from them, because they are as important and as meaningful as like the little births and the little wins, and ultimately help towards a sort of like end game, this end destination. What advice you would offer to someone maybe starting to think about their own transition into like being in community and being in more of these like natural like cycles of life and space and nature? What advice would you give to somebody thinking about that as they're deciding if that's right for them?
Mhm. Mhm. I get asked this question a lot, surprisingly, of like, what can I do to prepare? Or like, what can I do to like understand better, like what to expect? And I think I'm gonna fall back to the one that I always share is to be curious and like to really follow that sense of wonder and awe that I think we all have, but to exist in our society and cultural norms, we kind of have to suppress or diminish that just to be functional and to participate in what people think of like as a productive manner. And so I think when we can pause and just like really just like hum and haw about something and remember that that is equally as important as like this is cheesy to say too, but like the journey is just as important as the outcome. And so like I know that we like have probably read that and heard that 1,000 times, but just like really remembering that like these moments, the collection are really what make the outcome. And so if you're looking for something um, outside of you, it's likely needs to be born or like in ignited inside of you. And so curiosity and just wonder and awe of both like whether it be the person sitting across from you at the table or the person you sit next to on a bus or on the airplane, like really just kind of like not that you have to act on it, but just really being like letting those moments exist.
I love this. Well, thank you so much for everything that you've shared, the work that you're doing in the world, which is extremely powerful. How can we keep in touch with you personally as you finish up this path of exploring the master and divinity and maybe start sharing some lessons there? And then also just within the cabin neighborhoods, how do we keep in touch?
Yeah. So personally, I think the best way is Twitter, obviously. It's just my first and last name, so Chalice Stroebe. And then at Cabin, Chalice at cabin.city is the direct line, also in the Discord, but email is probably, I don't know, more traditional, so I tend to that. But I do exist in the Discord as well as my first name, so I'm there too.
Amazing. Well, we will definitely be following
Yeah.
along. I know I will personally be going and checking out Cabin, the OG Cabin in Austin, um, very shortly. So I can't wait to see that, and just really am so excited about what you all are building.
Thank you. Well, we can't wait to see you on the trail.
Amazing. Thanks so much, Chalice.